Where should we set our expectations?
Hey, Kailey, great to be back with you. So I think the answer to that is low. And with the Trump administration, anything is possible. It's only been a week since that disastrous meeting in the Oval Office, and a lot has changed in the last week. The Europeans have woken up, and they're starting to take their own security very seriously. So what we know is that there are 3 top American diplomats, including Secretary of State Rubio, going to Riyadh, along with Yermak, the head of the presidential administration from Ukraine. But as your analyst just said, the sticking point in all of this are security guarantees. It looks like the Trump administration wants out of this mess as soon as possible, and they really don't care very much about the details. They want a ceasefire, and they're not really that into the details on how to ensure that Russia doesn't come back and doesn't have the capability to attack Ukraine again. And that's the one issue that Ukraine is very adamant about.
So the line out of Russia is that Vladimir Putin is ready for a truce, Melinda Haring, with conditions. Do you believe that?
So with conditions is the key word, Joe. So they want to go back to the conditions they talked about in early 22 at Istanbul, and they are non-starters for Ukraine. It includes NATO neutrality in Ukraine. No, that's not going to happen. And that's against U.S. policy. That's a U.S. policy for 30 years has been that sovereign countries get to determine their own geopolitical orientation. So, you know, it's not consistent with our own policy, and it's a non-starter in Ukraine. There's other issues as well. So what happens to those 4 regions of Ukraine that the Russians illegally occupy? Russia just wants to freeze the territory and claim that territory as its own. It's a non-starter in Ukraine. The status of Crimea is another big dispute. There's a lot of issues to work through, but what Russia is putting on the table is a non-starter for Ukraine.
Well, Melinda, as you refer to the areas of Ukraine which Russia is currently occupying, how does that factor into the minerals deal that the president has signaled he still wants to sign with Ukraine? Because isn't a lot of that material actually in areas in which Russia is currently in control? And how is that a complicating factor in all of this?
Right. So I think it's important to say that the minerals deal is a future deal. It's on future deals that any kind of minerals that would be extracted in the future. So it's not, it doesn't have anything to do with here and now. J.D. Vance has said this is the security guarantee. And what he means is if the United States and Ukraine sign this deal, it's giving others assurance that U.S. companies intend to go in and that basically they shouldn't mess with us. But yes, a lot of the minerals that companies would want to extract are in occupied Ukraine, which obviously complicates this, which implies that the United States would be incentivized to allow Ukraine to return those territories. But the starting point that I was just talking about that the Russians want to start with is that Ukraine would give up its diplomatic and military desire to return those lands. So they're saying it's yours. And that's a non-starter, like I said, in Kiev.
It's pretty interesting to listen to this conversation as we move forward here. Melinda, I don't know what you think comes next, but this meeting, presumably next week, might unlock future talks. But we're hearing from the administration that essentially Kyiv has not been an honest broker with talks. We heard from Scott Bessent that he was mistreated when he went to Kyiv, made to wait in a dark room, that he had it out with President Zelenskyy. What are you hearing about this interaction?
So, look, Ukrainians are very firm. They've been at war for 3 years. And I think, Joe, when I look back at the Oval Office meeting, some things went wrong. Obviously, some things went wrong. But one of the most interesting things is Zelenskyy is not a native English speaker. He's a beginning language student. I've taught English students to Ukrainians for years. And I would not put him in front of a hot mic under any circumstances. He had an interpreter behind him, and he should have used it. And what's notable is that a lot of the sentences he said, he was translating from Ukrainian in his head. And they're normal things to say, but when they're translated directly, as he did, they sound very aggressive to an English speaker. So I think there was a lot of misunderstanding in that meeting, and it would have given them both some time if he'd used an interpreter. But look, we saw in the statement that Trump made today that he finds the Ukrainians difficult to work with, and the Ukrainians are not going to simply capitulate and give Americans what they want. And I think that's what they're responding to, is that the Ukrainians, they feel like they have agency, and this Trump administration just wants to bulldoze everyone, and the Ukrainians are not going to allow that.
And finally, Melinda, before we let you go, with the actions we have seen the administration take in recent days, the withholding of assistance that was slated to go to Ukraine, now we understand the stoppage of sharing of certain intelligence. What has that actually done to Ukrainian ability on the battlefield right now?
That's a great question. So here's the deal. 20% of Ukraine's kit comes from the United States. And 20% may not sound like a substantial number, but that 20% is the most lethal of all the equipment. And much of that equipment does not have analogous Ukrainian systems. That's why this is such a big deal. So the three big items to highlight are the intelligence sharing, and we have the best intelligence in the world, and it cannot be, there's no easy answer to this solution. And what that means, the Ukrainians have had a lot of, this is a David versus Goliath fight, and the Ukrainians are obviously at a big disadvantage, but they've had our intelligence sharing and they've hit a lot of major targets, and that's not an accident. So they don't have real-time actionable intelligence that they can use for strikes. So that is a big disadvantage. The second big disadvantage, and one that most analysts are worried about, is the turning off of Patriot systems. So Ukraine has other air defense systems, but the Patriots are special. The Patriots are the only ones that can take down the Russian ballistic rockets, and those are the fastest ones, and there's no European system or Ukrainian system that can take down these rockets. And then third are the HIMARS systems. There's no there's no Ukrainian equivalent that can easily be substituted in. So these are the reasons why this is such a big deal. Will the Ukrainians lose overnight? No. Will they stop fighting overnight? No. But it will have an effect, and we'll probably start to see that effect on the battlefield in probably 2 to 3 months.